From your talk now, there's evidently as many points and richness as there was in Päivikki's, but still the turn that I will bring with me is the stacking of these questions that you use in a way to pitch the museum space and its relationship to graphic processes, as it were, where the stacking of different layers of queries in printmaking that could range from professional via intermediary to public audiences serve to identify the contemporary layers of printmaking, where the stacking of layers becomes a method of analysis. And the overflow from these layers that make them bleed into each other could be a new generation of contemporary print. I think that you show these, the women's questions and also the punctuation utopian Kant works are instances of such, I mean, a kind of a concentrated focus on this instance of a multiplication in the museum space that could be come in dialogue with some of the points that Päivikki raised as another mode of expanding. The third speaker in the panel this morning is Nina Bondeson, and she will, I think, give a more political address of the field. The title of her talk is Language and the World, Report from a Changed Topography. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really excited about this seminar and excited about the title, Printmaking in the Expanded Field, and really hoping that we will get some expansion going here. I will first introduce myself by showing you a small PowerPoint, like 2 minutes, and after that, so that you will see what kind of art that I make, and know what kind, who the artist is talking to you. And after that PowerPoint, I will read to you. So, can you just, because I don't know the PC. Okay, yeah. That's good. So now I won't need this apparatus anymore, so I think I will just get up to you guys so I can see you a little bit better. I have to tell you the story about my glasses first, because when I came to Oslo at the bus terminal, I had the funniest little accident. It was like a film strip. A guy bumped into me in the escalator, so I sort of fell over, my glasses fell off, and immediately I get blinded. I mean, I see nothing when I take my glasses off. And they fell down, and my husband saw this woman picking them up and leaving with them. You know? So we were kind of running around trying to find them. So it just feels good for me to say this, because if you want to talk to me, or if you sort of say hello to me and I don't respond, it's because I don't see you. I can see, now I have my computer glasses, so I can see, I see that it's people here. So I will read to you, people. An expanded field in art is often referred to, but it is as mythological as Axis Mundi or any land of plenty and free of want. Art today is rather driven into a contemporary misunderstanding, denied its affiliation to our inborn language ability, confined to a cultural sector, and ruled by a harsh hegemony. Art is a lingual possibility, an existential tool for interpersonal communication. It can be a profession, but it is not a profession in itself. Due to its linguality, it is a human affiliation. And the one problem that has dominated the 20th century and still does is that of the relationship between language and the world. Therefore, the notion of the expanded field in art must also be understood in connection to where and how art takes place in society. There are, of course, differences between different countries, and this talk is based on my personal experiences from being first an art student and then an artist in Sweden for 40 years. It includes the shift from modernism to contemporary art, which, when it occurred in Sweden, was not a stealth change. It was a radical and rapid and quite antagonistic change. I do not focus on the specificities of printmaking here. I include printmaking in the diverse material and craft-based language area in art that was affected by this change. Today in Sweden, art is being abandoned by educational policies. The notion of creativity through art is replaced by a notion of creativity through entrepreneurship. A new educational policy implemented in 2009 decided that entrepreneurship was to pervade all stages in Swedish education from preschool to university level. This is a heavily biased political standpoint, a direct submission to a global neoliberal order, and it is a severe blow to a critical general education where art should be part of our language education. In Sweden, also, preparatory schools in art were for decades open to both young students on their way to higher art education, as well as to people that, with a lot of previous occupational experience, immersed themselves into art studies. Now the overriding assignment for these schools is to prepare for higher art education, period. There was also a proposal that students that choose to study art or the humanities should get stricter terms on their student loans than other students, since they were considered unprofitable. The proposal was denied this time. This is the contemporary situation in Sweden. All art is put under pressure. The societal political approach to art is not concerned with anything that resembles an expanded field. On the contrary, it is getting increasingly harder for artists to get hold of space and time to make art at all, and harder for the public and non-professional artists of all ages to participate. Art is more and more valued in relation to a notion of economic growth, which makes us lose the perspective of its linguality, because the value of that is not translatable into monetary value. Still, if I were to crown the most common statement in contemporary art the last 20 years, it would be, anything is possible in contemporary art. And some 160 art biennials in the Western art world are frequently referred to prove it. Artists can do anything, work in any material or non-material, and it is often manifested in large-scale, impressive installations and a lot of explanatory text. Interesting things can be seen, for sure. But how do they come about? And what are the contemporary terms and conditions for the actual making of art, away from biennial manifestations? What does it take to create meaning through art today? What scopic regimes that determine how we look at and value that what we look at? What scopic regimes are active and influential? And who is allowed to participate? For that discussion, a shift of focus is needed from the expanded field as a cheerful metaphor to the expanded field as a practicable reference in a political situation. From anything is possible to what does it take to make something possible at all? To acknowledge and give room to the whole spectrum of what is really going on in art today, from material and craft-based art making that creates meaning aside from verbal language, to a conceptual and immaterial art making that uses verbal language to create meaning, and all the cross-fertilizations that occur between them. If I were to topograph the area where I have been an artist for 40 years, I would have to inscribe a lot of craft-based work in different materials. When I started my art education in 1975, the craft in artwork was self-evident. The tradition that I am part of stems from a craft-based physical work. I was, of course, taught that this work in itself did not create art. But on the other hand, there was no widely spread thought in Sweden then that there could be art without material and craft-based skills. The actual material-based art making legitimized both the artist and art itself. An artist made or processed artifacts to have them carry meaning aside from verbal explanatory language. This is an accessible kind of art making because we have, since millenniums, an inherited readiness for the complex visual communication that it can generate. A scrap of paper and a pencil can get you going, and from a very young age, too. It does not offer any effortless understanding, but it does not call for academic studies either. What it needs is time, space, and an adequately interested and encouraging surrounding. From there, it can evolve to any level of complexity through your own work in communication with others. This combination of accessibility and complexity is something I cannot give up on. Today, the lack of general understanding and political encouragement for this linguality worries me, because to deal with our contemporary, pluralistic, and constantly changing situation, we need all the language we can acquire. Still, as long as we are able to buy drawing pads and crayons for kids in supermarket, there is hope. The last half-century, our understanding of art has gone through a big change, from a notion that art making is emblematic of human life to an approach to art as a profession, from a focus on material-based craft to a focus on verbal language, from objects and imagery to text, both part of visual communication, but on very different terms. I would say that the change we have seen is in a way as big as the change that occurred with the iconoclastic controversy in the Christian church 1,200 years ago. I won't go into that here, but that was a really big change, huge. Our contemporary change shows historical connections from Plato, Hegel, and Duchamp, among others, who were all more interested in ideas than physical images. But the final breakthrough of a conceptual art occurred in the US in the early 1960s, and it came with driving emancipatory ambitions, a revolutionary change set out to free art and creativity from the old and formal and outdated ways of thinking and doing and being an artist. The radical change had academically, philosophical, and textual roots, and it was brought about through verbal language, away from mimetic presentations of images. Artists promised themselves and each other and the world to make no more boring art. So what was this new art? Artists and art historians kept suggesting ways to explain what was going on. In 1963, artist Henry Flint declared, "Conceptual art is an art of which the material is language." When I read that statement 30 years later, I understood that conceptual art was indeed an extraordinary break with the traditions of artifactual imagery that for centuries had been entrenched in the Western field of art. It made art sort of loosen from the artifact to find new ways using verbal language that thus was given special prominence. I also understood that the difference between my craft-based ways of making art and the conceptual, textual artist ways of making art lies in our different affinity to verbal language. At first, an expanded field in art has a promising ring to it. And since Rosalind Krauss wrote her text on sculpture in the expanded field almost 40 years ago, the metaphor has spread to all art areas. But depending on your position in the topography, the expansion implies very different consequences. As a material-based artist today, I have to verbalize my artistic experience to justify what I do. And I have to justify what I do to get an acting space. My topography would consequently also describe where the verbal invasion in art broke through and how it affected terms and conditions in the habitation of material and craft-based art making, like printmaking, painting, ceramics, or embroidery. The knowledge production carried out in this area became subordinated in this verbal expansion. And in the craft-based art tradition, we were not trained to verbalize. We were like sitting ducks in this shootout of explanatory texts and theories between theorists, artists, and art critics that, once it broke through, really fast reshaped the circumstances in art. The textual approach got a firm grip of the hegemonical prerogative and started to name, assess, and evaluate, include and exclude, all with the help of the institutional theory of art that was launched in 1974 by George Dickey in order to try to find ways to separate art from not art. In a time when art did no longer depend on an artifact and anything could become art. But to continue the topography, from my position in the terrain, the field was never expanded, it was colonized. Settlers with a completely different understanding of art moved in where me and my colleagues worked and took over. My survival strategy was to start a theoretical self-education to try to find out what was happening. This education has now been going on for more than 20 years, and I have learned a lot, for sure. I became a better teacher in today's art education, which has helped me to make a living. It has given me a better understanding of how I can situate my art practice in relation to other art practices. I can defend myself better against irrelevant definitions of what it is I do in art. This theorization is supportive when trying to find out the societal terms and conditions of art, but it is predatory in relation to the actual art making. It has not in any way made me a better artist in the tradition where I choose to participate. This is a standpoint that was constantly rejected when I worked as a textile professor in the University of Gothenburg. The university, I think, is a lame supervisor and administrator of craft-based art education or any other knowledge production with reference systems outside of the bibliognostic. The university unhesitatingly defines the experiences of others, but is totally unable to regard itself as ignorant. In that realm, craft-based art became like the bullied wife in an oppressive marriage, trying to negotiate. We have a problem, let's talk it through, and always getting the same answer. What problem? We're fine, there's nothing to discuss. The contemporary hegemony established a very harsh rule. I am not hostile to theories. I am not trying to re-establish some old Western dichotomy between theory and practice. But if we want to realize an expanded field, I do find it important to look at different aspects of knowledge production in art and understand the importance to acknowledge differences, not between theory and practice, but between different practices, including their different theoretical belongings. I have seen some sad consequences when the situation in art is not open to debate and discussion. The demands on a textual approach in higher art education was launched in the mid-90s in total confusion among university management, teacher, and of course students. Nothing was openly discussed or tried. Theories were randomly airdropped without any profound consideration. The sad thing is that even this befuddlement could have been proven fruitful given a chance to be a starting point. But since the change was considered to be non-negotiable, the confusion became more of an end station. The art world focused on text and pawned off practical skills. All kinds of craft-based art was being subordinated. To immerse in painting without a postmodern ironical comment included was mistrusted, as was any outspoken interest for techniques and methods in printmaking. Artists doing traditional studio work were considered backwards and were often ridiculed. To oppose this situation was very difficult. The expectations of unconditional Anschluss to the textual understanding of art undermined all attempts to question it. To criticize a harsh hegemony is always a hazardous task to undertake. The critique will be considered as irregular. In itself, the very proof that the critic is wrong. The hegemonical power works undercover as the self-evident, and when you oppose what is regarded as self-evident, you risk looking stupid, because the self-evident don't even look like power. So you appear to oppose to nothing. The critic is therefore easily shamed, and we all have a need and a want to fit in. We like the company of others. Us humans are animals that cooperate. We are skillful collaborators for good and for bad. We are also domestic pets. We like to be cuddled by people in power and position. It makes us feel safe. But it is not a good climate for debate. We live in a time that has developed a superstitiously oversized overconfidence in theoretical analysis and in our ability to overview and effectively control everything. In all of society, we have to verbally articulate our experiences and justify ourselves through text, not only in art. As part of the hegemony, this relation to text and verbal language becomes incontestable, like the weather or outbursts of volcanoes. But it is all man-made. It is all possible to question, possible to oppose, discuss, and renegotiate. There will always be hegemonical struggles, but a hegemony can be more or less open to dialogue and influence, more or less democratic. The ruling hegemony can be questioned. How we understand art and what societal space we give it can be renegotiated. A few years back, I was invited to a 2-day seminar with artists from Scandinavia, Estonia, and Russia. The curators and some of the artists gave talks. One of the curators addressed us, the artists at the seminar, the printmakers. He said there was nothing wrong with printmaking. It was okay for us all to be printmakers, as long as we did not talk about printmaking techniques. Just don't do it, he said. Don't talk about it. No one is interested. The contemporary art world is not interested, nor is the public, nor the art market. I felt as we were collectively diagnosed with a Tourette-like disability, liable to occur in printmakers, obsessed with an unstoppable urge to constantly talk about forbidden and socially unacceptable subjects. And I wish we were. I really wish we were, because that must be, by far, the best way to undermine a harsh hegemony. Thank you.